Thank you very much. Welcome everybody. Thank you for coming to this. To start us off, I want to try to do some interactive work, and this is pursuing the thing that I said yesterday. I said that the central slogan for science and technology studies is, "It could be otherwise." Do you remember? It could be otherwise. When times get difficult, when you're not sure how to question something, always say to yourself, it could be otherwise. And when you're talking to your colleagues, other students, and you're having a hard day, say to each other, it could be otherwise. Okay? So we have a few examples just to start us off of things which could be otherwise. These are all descriptions of technologies. They are all descriptions of the effects of technologies. Your task is to guess what is the technology which it is describing. Do you understand? Okay. So here's the first one. This is what this technology was described as. Does it not mean the breakdown of artificial national barriers and the welding of humanity into one composite whole? Does it not mean that each is given a chance to comprehend the significance of national and international affairs, and that all the evils of jealousy and hatred being thus displayed before the world will no longer fester, but be cleansed by the antiseptic of common understanding and common sense? Which technology is this describing? Any suggestions? Sorry? Internet? Any other suggestions? No. Good answer, but wrong. Other suggestions? I won't let you just be silent. You've got to give a suggestion. Sorry? Radio? Very good guess. Radio. This is what was said about the radio in 1924.
Has a good memory from yesterday.
Yes, that's right. Very. Next technology. When we entered Cambridge, we found an apathetic, dispirited community, afraid to discuss its problems. But in the past few weeks, we have watched a ferment grow in this town. We have watched people as they began to talk about their problems in the open for the first time. This talk need not and must not end with the... What technology are they talking about? Guesses, please? Yes? Sorry?
Campus Square.
Can't hear, sorry.
Campus Square.
Campus Square. Campus Square, okay. No, good answer. Anyone? Email? No. Newspaper? Good guess. Anyone around this? What's your guess, sir? Yes. Okay, and the answer is television. This is what was said about community television at the experiment done in 1952. Okay. Next one. Are you getting the idea now? Okay. This technology will be subversive to any group. Great stuff, subversive technology. Bureaucracy or individual which feels threatened by a coalescing of grassroots consciousness, because not only does decentralized, whatever it is, serve as an early warning system, it puts people in touch with each other about common grievances. What are we talking about here? Sorry? I can't hear again. Blogs, yes. Internet, blogs, good guesses, but no. Anyone at the end there? What's your guess? You would have said internet, all right, but it's not. Something else? Mobiles? No, but good guess. It's community video. And this is what was said about community video in the early 70s experiments to link up communities through videos. Are you getting the hang of this now? You're slowly getting the hang of this, right? Community video was a way of putting links between TVs in a particular area in the United States, so that people could see and could communicate with each other over a video. Yeah. Okay, and this is...
It's not cable video for the community, right?
yes, it is.
But it's
Cable video for the community, yeah. No, well, you wouldn't. I'm sorry, these are really Western examples. This one is not a Western example, okay? Think about this one. The technology, it's the awakening of a new era. The town comes into the village comes into the town, the separation comes to an end. Town and village merge more and more. This is the new time with richer, broader and more mobile civilization, a back to nature which, however, keeps all the advantages of culture. It's fantastic. Don't you want this? Don't you want it? Okay, what is it? Internet again? No.
Garden cities?
Sorry?
Garden cities?
Garden cities? No. Nice try. Local trains? What about the end here? Can I pick somebody out? Yes, sir. You have an idea.
very easy, 1924.
Transportation, no?
No. You're going to kick yourselves? Sorry?
Something about trains.
Trains, very interesting idea. On the right tracks, but no. Good. I mean, you know, there would have been a box of chocolates prize for anyone who could.
Ford T model.
Ford T model, the car? No. Can't get it, huh? Okay, the answer is the bicycle. This is what was said about the bicycle in about 1873. This fantastic new technology which is going to completely change our lives and so on. So are you starting to get the idea here? Now, the interesting thing is, as more and more of you are making more and more suggestions, it looks like just about any technology might suit. And what this is telling us is that there's a recurrent hype, there's a recurrent set of statements about the effects of new technologies. And we need to get much wiser about how any technology is plugged into this kind of way of doing it. Okay, so one last example to go, and it's a long one, I'm sorry about this. Over the course of a few years, a new communications technology annihilated distance and shrank the world faster and further than ever before. A worldwide communications network whose cables spanned continents and oceans, it revolutionized business practice and gave rise to new forms of crime. Romances blossomed. Secret codes were devised by some and cracked by others. The benefits of the network were relentlessly hyped by its advocates and dismissed by the skeptics. Governments and regulators tried and failed to control the new medium, and attitudes to everything, from news gathering to diplomacy, had to be completely rethought. What is this? Sorry? Telegraph? Blogs? Sorry? Facebook? Very nice. Any other guesses? How about a guess from over there? What's your guess? Internet. Ah. Right. Well, again, the prize is won. This turns out to be what was said about the telegraph. Well done, yeah. In the mid 1840s. Okay. Thanks very much. That's the end of our kind of warm-up exercise. And now I'd like you to participate with the same energy during the talk I'm going to give, which is a talk under Oleg's title on laboratory life, or around laboratory life. Oh, that's good. How did it get that title? So I want to talk about reflecting on laboratory life, trying to work out, think about where STS has been provocative, where it's stopped being provocative, what are the prospects for going on being provocative, and so I'll talk a bit about the book. I want to talk a bit about the ways in which provocations in STS have shifted, they've changed and they've moved. And I want to try and to illustrate where I think there's interesting provocation at the moment by talking about some work I'm doing on mundane governance. I'll talk about the values of STS and then try and conclude. So, some things about laboratory life. I'm not sure, are people here familiar with Kuhn's book, Structure of Scientific Revolutions? Right. It's one of those books, it's a bit like Laboratory Life. A lot of people are familiar with it, but fewer have read it. And even fewer have bought it, right, which is a very sad thing for Laboratory Life. But okay, so you're familiar with it. At the time of the first edition of Laboratory Life, the big hot thing in STS, it wasn't called STS then, was Kuhn and the Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And a central point in Kuhn, perhaps one which is sometimes forgotten, is the problem of retrospective writing of history. And what Kuhn pointed out was that in histories of science, quite often people took a Whiggish perspective. They tried to understand history from the point of view of what we now know. So it was that he insisted that we go back and try and understand what it was like at the time of the scientific activity, and he was very concerned about doing a history of science as it was at the time. So please bear that warning in mind, because origin stories, talking about the origins of things like a book or the origin of laboratory life, is full of distortions and complexities, and sometimes outright lies. All right. So, are you ready? In 1976, I went to this meeting. 1976, when I was 19 years old, I went to this meeting at. Yeah, sure. Are you okay with me? Yeah, okay. Did he say I was 19 years old? Yeah, okay. I was just 19 when I went to this meeting in San Francisco and met Bruno Latour. And the meeting was on the use of quantitative indicators in the history of science. And I was there because my first ever publication was a complaint that people using quantitative methods did not really understand what was going on in science. It was my first ever presentation. I was a graduate student. The chairman for my session, who introduced himself just before I started talking, came over and said, "Hello, I'm your chairman, Robert Merton." And I know some of you have this kind of absurd regard and deference for senior people in the field, but imagine how scared I was to meet Robert Merton, first of all.
Were you really 19?
No.
Okay, that's...
And in that same year was the first meeting of the Society for Social Studies of Science at Cornell. The first 4S meeting was also in 1976. So I met Bruno at that meeting, and he suggested that we get together. We were extremely bored at this conference, and he invited me to go and visit him where he just arrived at the Salk Institute in San Diego. And Bruno had been invited to the Salk Institute by Roger Guillemin, who is a family friend of the Latours from France. And he'd invited Bruno to go and write about the careers of great scientists, of which Roger Guillemin imagined he was one. So Bruno was in place in the Salk Institute, all set to write this story about the careers of great scientists. And I came along. At that point, Bruno had not yet discovered social studies of science, or sociology of science as it was called, and it seemed to me like a really interesting opportunity to describe science from the inside, to look at science as it happens. And so the project was to try and describe science as it happens, both in situ, that is, by being in the place where science happens, actually physically in there with the scientists, and similarly in contemporary vein, so in recognition of Kuhn's argument that we were doing it as it happened at the particular time that it happened, rather than trying to write about it retrospectively. So the as it happens clause was extremely strong. At that time, the world was alive with disputes between sociologists and philosophers, and in particular, objectivist philosophers were some of the main targets of provocation for sociologists of science. But similarly, Merton was very prominent as a sociologist of science in the United States, and he was also a target for provocation by the European sociologists of science, who were not interested in understanding science in an institutional sense. They wanted to understand science in terms of its content. And I think that kind of initial provocation is very important to the book and its subsequent treatment. And I think even today it's quite important when you're negotiating access to get into a laboratory. And I know that some of you, Anna in particular, have done this kind of work too. To talk to the scientists about what it is that one is going to do when one joins the laboratory. Typically, at that time, I would have a conversation with the scientists about what philosophers of science said. So we would discuss what philosophers of science said about how science was done, and we'd all have a good laugh. And the scientists would say, "You must be joking." And I told them what Popper said was the way to do science. And quite often these discussions would end by them saying, "Why don't you come into our laboratory and see what really happens in the laboratory?" So the philosophical position was a kind of foil, it was a provocative other in order to get access to the laboratory. Of course, at this time, there were a number of other studies of laboratories, and there were studies by myself and Latour, but also by Michael Lynch, Art and Artifact in the laboratory, by Karen Noor-Cetina, the manufacturer of knowledge, and I think Sharon Trawick was also working at that time on a book called Bean Times and Lifetimes, which came out quite a lot later. In Pasadena, in about 2006, there was a panel which met to discuss and celebrate the origin of laboratory studies. And much to my great embarrassment, there was an argument about multiple discovery. And so you had people in STS saying, well, if we all discovered laboratory studies together at the same time, it must be an important topic. And I thought to myself, for heaven's sake, whenever scientists talk to us about multiple discoveries, we are immediately skeptical. We immediately want to know why they would bring these things together, how they were constructed as multiple, why they would imagine that this meant there was a reality out there, and so on. And to my great disappointment, my colleagues on the panel were celebrating the reality of laboratory studies through a multiple discovery. I'm sorry, the point is a little bit complicated. Okay. I think since that time, it's very difficult to summarize STS in any kind of cogent way, but it's possible to try and do so along a couple of dimensions. And I want to talk about how the kinds of provocation that STS offers have shifted over time. So I want to talk about provocations in terms of symmetry. And here we have a table which attempts to do this. And you can see in the table there are different kinds of approaches to STS, which run from Mertonian sociology down through Kuhn, through the strong program, through actor network theory, to reflexivity and technography. And I think what's interesting about this trajectory, about this line of development, is that it represents changes in the argument about symmetry. So, for example, Merton's big contribution was to suggest that science was a social institution like any other kind of social institution. So before Merton, sociologists had studied education, the family, religion, work, all were social institutions. But nobody had thought of treating science in the same way. So Merton's big achievement was to say science is a social institution like any other social institution. In other words, Merton was forcing a symmetry with respect to science and other institutions. I think Kuhn was pushing a kind of symmetry too, in arguing that paradigms are essentially symmetrical with each other. That is, the basis for one set of developments in history is on a par and has to be understood as symmetrical with developments in another set of sciences at a particular time in history. So Kuhn is forcing or presenting us with or offering a symmetry with regard to different kinds of paradigm within science. The strong program, mostly associated with Edinburgh, was pushing another kind of symmetry, and that is the symmetry between true and false scientific knowledge. So authors like Barnes and Bloor and Chapin were saying it is important to understand false knowledge using the same kinds of explanation as you would use to explain true knowledge. In other words, suggesting that we treat symmetrically whether or not knowledge is received as true or as false. Actor network theory then offers us yet another symmetry. And the symmetry it offers is the symmetry between humans and non-humans. Whereas previously, all scientific action was understood as a social construction being produced by humans, actor network theory proposes that we treat humans and non-humans symmetrically, that they co-construct each other, that they are both to be included as important elements in the picture. So once again, you have the pushing of a new kind of symmetry. And what I love about STS is this, it seems this constant ability to come up with yet another stimulating symmetry, a provocative symmetry along the way. And I think people still find actor network theory challenging because it suggests and implies a symmetry whereby we treat non-humans, animals, objects, things, on a par with humans, and we make no difference between them at the start of our explanatory venture. And that gives my students lots of trouble. It gives a lot of people a lot of trouble. It seems so counterintuitive as a way of starting. And I think last thing to mention on this slide is the symmetry that's proposed between the people doing the analysis and the subjects of the analysis. And this is where the reflexivist move comes in. Why would I imagine that myself and other people doing STS have any better access to what's going on in science than the scientists themselves? Can we produce analyses of science which include the scientist in our own analysis? And there are a number of really interesting experiments where we try to include the voice of scientists as part of our own papers. And you may know some of these. I don't know whether Oleg has let you loose on the reflexive writing very much yet. So for example, you would have a straight text where the authorial voice is speaking about what scientists do, and then about halfway through the text, a scientist would appear and say, I disagree entirely with all that. I think you've got us completely wrong. And then there's a conversation between the author and the scientist. And that's an effort to push a symmetry between the observer and the observed, to try and dismantle that kind of power relationship which has been assumed so far. Okay, so that's one sort of dimension of shifting provocations that have occurred in STS. And I find that helpful as a way of organising my thinking in terms of situating all the different things you come across in STS. You can understand each of those as a different kind of provocation on symmetry. Another set of dimensions in terms of shifting provocations, and one which I think is even more exciting, is the move over time between an emphasis on essentialist approaches to science and technology through to post-essentialist approaches. So this diagram is organised in a sort of timeline that moves from essentialism to post-essentialism. As we move down the picture here, you have different kinds of approaches within STS. So I'm not sure how clear this is, but at the top here, a very essentialist way of looking at things included technological determinism, or the notion that technology was neutral, and that gave way to a form of constructivism, and we are moving away somewhat from essentialism as we get to constructivism, but we still got a long way to go before we get to post-essentialism. Right, so this is a sort of a map to make sense of the ways in which the provocations have shifted with respect to essentialism. To put some meat on this, and I can let people have copies of this if it might be useful. Might it be useful as a summary? I mean, of what happens. We can populate this map with some popular slogans, which you will have come across in your reading, and you've heard from various authors. So it could be otherwise seems absolutely central to all this move, and in particular central to the move from essentialism to constructivism, the contention that it could be otherwise. Another slogan which characterizes this move is the idea that technology is congealed social relations. That is, to understand what a technology is and its likely impacts, you have to think of technology as embodying assumptions about the social world, about the producers, about the users. Technology embodies those social relations and packs them in a way which makes them difficult to unpack. Technology is congealed social relations. Latourian idea, technology is action at a distance. It is a way of having an effect, of making a difference, even if you yourself are not actually present at the scene of the action. So it's a way of acting in being remote. Technology is a form of politics by other means. So although political scientists talk about the use of technology, this approach argues that technology has politics built into it, that the very use of the technology is to do politics. So we had the example yesterday of Moses Bridges. The argument, which is I think actually wrong, but the argument is that Langdon Winner built these bridges, and these bridges contain politics. They have the capacity to prevent certain people travelling on buses. Technology is politics by other means. And related slogan, technology is society made durable. It's a way of building society which is very difficult to deconstruct, unpack, unlock. And very often the society that's built, the social relations which are congealed, are done so in material form. You get a society built into a particular technological device, a set of social relations appear in a material form and are enacted by using that particular technology. A slight move, I think, downwards, away yet further from essentialism, is the notion that reception and use of technologies are socially distributed. You recall yesterday we talked about the certainty trough, and the certainty trough is very much a useful device for reminding us that reception and use are socially distributed. So, just some comments so far on where we've got to in the diagram. Constructivism was okay, but it's really got some problems. There's a very restricted use of the "it could be otherwise" clause. It often assumes that interpretive flexibility ends at a moment of consensus. You know, once those bicycles are built, then there's no more sociology to be said, which I think is wrong. And I think there are definite elements of accepted technical definitions which are smuggled into the analyses. As we move towards post-essentialism, you see there's less dependence on standard social political variables, things like motives, interests, technical capacity, context, identity. This is what is so exciting about STS. It is not just bringing us news about science and technology. It is asking us to rethink how we do social science. Because we are changing our ideas about what count as the key entities here. About whether it's the humans or the non-humans, for example, which are important. If that question is to be addressed properly, we can no longer rely on ideas like social influences, social institutions, and so on. I'm sorry, Michelle, but she's not here, so it's okay. So there's much greater emphasis now on processes, on fluidity, on performativity, on messiness, and we have to understand technology as something which is not given, it's not just something which is constructed, but it is achieved, it is rendered, constituted, I'm sorry, this is technical stuff, as an unavoidable feature of the constant reproduction of social order. This is ethnomethodology speaking, I'm sorry. But technologies are thought more and more to be recursive, they're tentative, they're messy, they're indeterminate, they're contingent, and they're multiple. Technology, in other words, has to be understood as a form of situated action. What do I mean by that before I go back to my diagram? Take the view, imagine that technology is a constitutive social phenomenon. That whatever it is entirely constituted. And then treat questions about the definition and use of technology and the use of terms like technical and technical capacity as always situated social actions. Now again, we're making the point there is no such thing as technology separate from social actions. We cannot accept those definitions as a given in our analysis. And then you can examine how technical capacity is conferred, maintained, broken down in specific social and institutional circumstances. That applies to technology, but more interestingly still, this applies to objects in general. So you can say exactly the same thing about objects and things. Imagine that objects are a constitutive social phenomenon. Then you can treat questions about the definition and use of objects and the use of terms such as the character and nature of objects as situated social actions. And you can examine how the nature of an object is conferred, maintained, broken down in specific social and institutional circumstances. So we're moving to this very exciting and crazy edge of post-essentialism. And we're moving to the idea that we can think here in terms of relational ontologies. And that's what I mean by technology being situated social action. We need to adopt a strong perspective on governance. We need to think about is-ought connections. We need to think of the achieved ontological status of objects as key to behavior. And we want to think of ontology as situated and recursive. I'm going very quickly over that slide. You don't have to take any notice of it at all. But what I want to do now is add another slogan, and that's with relational ontologies, what one is into is understanding that technologies are made to seem what they are. And the business of the constitution of technologies is making them seem what they are, which is a long way now from the bad old essentialist days of technological determinism and technology as neutral. Now, So what you've just had in the last 10 minutes is a summary of a course that I teach over several months. And it's just to give you a flavour of the overview. And what I want to do now is make a few summary comments about what STS is, and then I'm going to give you some examples so that it's much less abstract than I've been saying. So, the value of STS and what's so exciting about it is because it is a set of provocations. It is a set of perspectives and approaches which are all listed there: actor network, certainty tropic, could be otherwise, and so on. This is the slide I had yesterday. STS is a fund of examples, stories, case studies, and so on, which can organize or stimulate thinking. I think we should not so much be telling Skolkovo Foundation, this is the truth, this is the way it actually is out there, but instead we need to be asking them to engage in a conversation where we rethink, where we develop curiosity, where we develop skepticism about assumptions and have a continual back and forth conversation. STS then is not a set of approaches, a set of methods, a set of findings. It is, I think, a set of sensibilities. And again, this is what I was saying yesterday. STS, what's important about STS is it has this capacity to cause trouble, to be awkward, to provoke. It has a character of working through difficult conceptual and theoretical issues using empirical case studies. So this is not abstract analytic philosophy. This is always tied to empirical materials. It has an inclination to deflate grandiose concepts and claims. When my colleagues talk about globalization, I want to say, hang on a minute. What is how does globalization happen? What are the little things on the ground which enable us to do globalization? And globalization turns out to depend on baggage handling, phrase books, barcodes, mobile phones, and a whole load of very, very mundane little things. It emphasizes the local, specific, and contingent. It's caution about using sociological lexicons, and it has a reflexive attention to notions of audience. At the center of all this, it seems, the sensibility. It's there again. It's that phrase which I hope you're already saying to each other, it could be otherwise. Okay. How to do this then? For guidance on this before I get into the examples. Remember, what we're trying to do is convert revered and standard ideas and concepts into objects of analysis. So select an idea or concept which seems so obvious, so entrenched, so taken for granted, the hardest thing you can possibly think of, and then we can STS it. If that's a verb, that's always it is. We can STS it. And you can do it in at least three different ways. You can emphasize the historical contingency. So you revert to a time when the concept was not established or taken for granted. What was it like in the world before mobile communication? You can emphasize the concept's cultural specificity. So you can identify a different cultural context in which the concept's not the same as in our own situation. Often we get fixed on particular ideas, and we need anthropologists to remind us that those ideas are not current in other societies which seem to work pretty well. And so my recommendation under that heading is to ethnographize the target concept. And you do that by adding ography to the target concept. So, do you feel spooked and in awe of the concept epistemology? Ethnographize it. Let us not talk about epistemology, but let us talk about epistemography. And epistemography is the study of the strange things that, well, philosophers and other people do to produce these set of ideas they call epistemology. Scale. Are you spooked and take for granted certain aspects of scale? Do you operate with the assumption that some things are big and some things are little? That there is the general and then there is the local? That there is the big and the little? We often, I don't know, I'm sure this doesn't happen here, but in my own department, professors are always saying, you've got to take the bigger picture into account. You've got to take the context into account, right? That kind of stuff. That seems a sort of a peculiar ethics of scale. Instead of accepting those distinctions between big and little, or trying to find a medium between the two, let us do scalography. Scalography is the study of how people perpetrate and maintain and communicate to each other this idea that some things are big and some things are little. Scalography. And the one I'm going to come on to and gives you an illustration, there will be some empirical illustrations in a minute. Okay. Ontology. Do not be spooked by ontology. You do not have to accept ontology as a given out there. Let us do instead an ontography, where we study how it is that people produce ontologies. What are the everyday practices and assumptions of the tribe of people who produce what they call ontologies? So once again, we are turning a revered and honoured idea and concept into an object of analysis by making it the target of anthropological study. So that's the second way of doing it. And the third approach here for making it otherwise is to emphasize the complex processes and practices involved in any of these concepts, and you have to engage in what I call, you have to gerondize the target. And by gerund, I'm sorry, the English is so sort of arcane. When you gerondize the target, you simply add ing to the word that you're trying to demolish or deconstruct or speak about. So, do not accept what counts as governance in a particular situation, in a particular organization, in a particular political agenda. Instead, try to understand the governancing that's going on, the practices and processes whereby people try and construct and constitute what counts as governance for them. Look at the governancing. There are lots of organizations which try to sell futures. Do not accept futures for what they just tell you, but try and understand their work in terms of the futuring that they are doing. That is, the complex practices and processes of building futures and trying to sell them to themselves and each others. Ethics is a particularly interesting one. Ethics is like a kind of holy grail, and you mustn't say anything negative about ethics, but it's very interesting to look in organization at how ethics are assembled, put together, specified, described, communicated to different kinds of people. That is the set of practices we could call ethicizing. So we turn ethics into ethicizing, evidence into evidencing, and so on. You can imagine a whole, and so it goes on. This is a formula that has no limits. Imagine. Okay. That's enough of that stuff. Let's get on to some examples from a project I've been involved in, which I hope will try and flesh out some of the things I've been saying, especially with regard to doing ontography. And this is a project on mundane governance. It is a book that I'm writing with Dan Nayland called Mundane Governance. It's coming out with Oxford University Press. It is one of the longest forthcoming books in the history of books. But it is great fun and a joy to write. And the starting point, really, of this investigation was the observation that there seems to be increasing regulation and control of our lives in relation to very everyday objects and ordinary technologies. And again, I apologize if these are specifically Western examples, but I suspect they have some application here. Recycling and waste. It used to be the case that you could just put your rubbish in a bag and stick it out the front door, and that was it. Nowadays, you have to be an expert on all the different kinds of recycling that you have. You have to distinguish between paper, shiny paper, wet paper, cardboard, wet cardboard, shoes fit for recycling, shoes not fit for recycling, and on and on and on. Endless lists. And this, we suggest, is a very interesting form of social control because it asks us to become competent members of society that understands these ways of organising our lives. We have 3 case studies in the book. One is on recycling and waste. The second is on traffic, particularly speed cameras and parking, traffic lights. And the third is on passenger movement and security in airports. Most of the current thinking on governance talks about governance in terms of human relationships, so that experts on governance in management circles, they worry about things like procedures, structures, committee composition, how often you have meetings, who reports to whom, when people should retire. That's what they think is good governance. The Neo-Foucauldians are more interesting, and they have a notion of social control which is that people comply through the adoption of subject positions. So Nick Rose has this quote. He says, what's interesting about governance is it's about governing without governing society. That is to say, you govern through the regulated and accountable choices of autonomous agents. Citizens, consumers, parents, employees, investors. Social control arises because people adopt the subject position of a good citizen, a responsible consumer, a concerned parent, a trustworthy employee, and so on. You don't need sanctions and threats and violence because you have a system where people adopt these subject positions. So that makes for an interesting mode of social control. And I think it's a very interesting suggestion. Our materials show very little evidence of internalization, and this model doesn't really acknowledge that governance is uncertain and disconnected and messy. And so it's a rather weak perspective. It rather neglects the role of materiality, and it takes the status and existence of entities for granted. So an alternative perspective is to talk about governance through accountability relations and to stress the importance of the mundane. And the mundane is more pervasive and consequential than our discussions of committee membership and so on. And I think what's interesting is it becomes clear that there's 2 senses of mundane here. Mundane in the English language means routine, everyday, taken for granted, boring, uninteresting, right? It's that stuff. But mundane also has this interesting Latin root which means of the world. And of the world seems to refer to the sense that things are mundane if they are just the way they are. They are obvious, out there, that is what they are. And what we're suggesting in this study is that social control and regulation of our lives is widespread in relation to the idea that things are just the way that they are. So that's what we mean by mundane governance. It's the governance in relation to ordinary, everyday things which are just accepted for what they are. And the accountability relations are extremely important at this in a number of ways. Okay, so I think one of the interesting things about doing this study is to discover that people get really upset about these little things. And although I was worried at first that I was moving from studies of Nobel-winning scientists and big deal developments in information technology, and I was now going to study recycling bins. It's a big jump. And I thought, recycling bins? Nobody's going to take any notice of what I say about recycling bins. But it turns out, if you look at the media, you look at the websites, you look at the local newspapers, enormous amount of coverage relates to those 3 areas of our study: trash, traffic, and transit. 3 areas of our study. The letters pages for the local newspapers, at least in the UK, 80% are about problems with trash, problems with recycling, problems with waste, problems with the bloody traffic lights, the speed cameras, problems with security in airports. This is what gets people going. This is what they're concerned about. Okay. So, There's public consternation, there's outrage and indignation, and there's concern that this is about excessive government interference, there's overzealous policing, and worse than that, overzealous policing in relation to stuff as ordinary as a recycling bin. And that's kind of gives rise to quite a lot of consternation. Here's some examples. The idea that you can get fined for putting the wrong sort of material in a recycling bin. People are getting very upset that it's now possible to have to pay a fine for that. Recently, when they issued in the UK new sets of plastic wheelie bins for collecting rubbish, it was discovered that the lids of the wheelie bins had a microchip in them. And there was widespread outrage and complaints because this was thought to be a form of surveillance. Why would you have a microchip in the container, in the rubbish container? Right. And people said this is Big Brother, this is surveillance society, and so on. There's enormous upset that speed cameras are generating excessive income for the police. There are now courses for re-educating speeding drivers. So if you get caught speeding, you have to go on a speed awareness course, a re-education course. I mean, a very nice part of this study was that I got caught speeding in Oxford, and I was offered a place on the course, and so a part of the book is a description. It's a wonderful kind of ethnographic day where I go to be re-educated.
Would you recommend ethnography of the prison?
Yes, so.
Technography.
Technography of the prison, yes, absolutely. Okay, there is considerable joy and, not to say a little entertainment, when traffic control systems break down and they are said to make no difference at all. So when a traffic light breaks down and yet the traffic flows as well as ever, or when parking regulations are suspended, and in one town in England they ran out of money to pay the parking wardens, and so anyone could park anywhere for 2 weeks. No problem, everyone said. Why the hell do we need parking regulations? We can do without them, and so on. Great upset about proposals to introduce ID cards with biometric data. That's quite a familiar one. Extraordinary airport security measures in response to threats of terrorist attacks. And the liquids rule, the whole thing about liquids rules is quite an extraordinary development in terms of you all know what you have to do when you go to the airport now. And part of the study, again, involved trying to smuggle on bottles which had less than 100 millilitres in them, but were very much bigger than 100 millilitres, and then having a discussion with the security person about why on earth are we being stopped for this? It's just the rule. Yes, but why is it the rule? It's just the rule. Okay. Here's one of my favourite examples of this. This is the day that the new Pope was announced in 2005. The new Pope was elected, and so a matter of concern to several billion people around the planet was the election of the new Pope. Who was it, and so on, and there's his picture. But that item of news is dwarfed by the main headline, and the main headline is that there's this speed trap earning excessive amounts of money for the government and the police, and that's much more important for the people who are reading this paper than the mere election of the Pope, the head of the Catholic Church. We're interested in ideas which we call mundane terror. And mundane terror is where very ordinary objects seem to acquire some alternative or extraordinary properties. So you see here the top left, it's a key, it looks like a key, but it turns out to be a knife. And we're very interested in objects which, on the one hand, are just objects, on the other hand, they are objects of potential terror. This photograph on the left of this guy is quite interesting to me. This is a photograph of somebody who smuggled through security this penknife. And here he is on board the aircraft, having someone take a picture of him in a sort of, I got this through the security kind of way. And I think what's so interesting about this photograph, for me anyway, is that you look at this guy holding the penknife, and what you start to notice is that he has rather staring eyes. And then you look again and you see that he's got a beard. And then you ask, why am I seeing these things in this picture? And it's because of the mundane terror associated with this object, which is an object which is out of place. It is a forbidden object. It's an object of threat, which is supposed not to be on the plane, and yet he somehow smuggled it onto the plane. So this is a case where ordinary objects are acquiring an insecure ontology, and they are not what they seem. And he's, enough about it. Okay. And of course the liquids rules, which came in 2006 across Europe for a start, have now very detailed instructions, a bit like the recycling. You have to be an expert on all kinds of liquids and volumes, and when is a paste not a paste, when is a paste a liquid, if it's frozen, is it a liquid, and so on and so forth. And there are these very detailed instructions, and the typology of the liquids, it seems to me, enacts what counts as a responsible traveller. So again, you have the ontological status of the object defining and regulating what counts as an appropriate holder, carrier of these objects. So this brings us to looking at what I think of as the ontological politics. This is a term derived from Anne-Marie Moll and John Law, of course. And the research principle, it could be otherwise, of course. Have you heard that before today? It could be otherwise. And you examine the social and material practices whereby entities acquire this mundane status, and notice that ordinary objects can become mundane and not mundane. And it's no longer just about objects, it's about ontologies. And the idea in this research is you have to try and figure out what are the ontological politics, what are the processes and practices whereby entities emerge from this ontological soup. And I think the use of the word politics here is just to denote the contingency of processes and practices. So what we are doing here is a kind of ontography. We are documenting how the existence, the nature, and the capacity of these entities comes into being. This is not just about labeling previously existing entities. It's about finding how these entities come into being, and it's about interrogating the relational agency for a relational basis for the agency. And what one has to do quite carefully in this kind of writing is to make sure that you invert a lot of our assumptions about objects and people, and in particular very much recommend that one inverts or subverts accepted definitions and understandings of the relationships involved. So in the book we talk about mundane governments in terms of objects and their persons, and that's a deliberate attempt to invert the normal set of assumptions, because we tend to regard humans as owning or having or possessing objects. And so we want to see what happens if you start by challenging that assumption. So we talk about cars and their owners, we talk about recycling bins and their householders, and so on. Give you a couple of examples of this, and the first example is what I call mucontology. And this is from some episodes that came out of issues in McDonald's. And the first episode, which you may have heard of, in the early 2000s, a group of people tried to sue McDonald's for selling food which caused obesity and diabetes. And the question here is, who or what is accountable for the obesity caused by fast foods? So, I mean, I think this was a really interesting episode for me, because I had assumed before that people understood there was a problem with McDonald's food, and if you wanted to avoid obesity and diabetes, you made the choice. Don't buy the hamburger. But in this episode, there was an attempt to shift the accountability by claiming that it was the fault of the manufacturer, McDonald's, for causing the obesity. So in 2002 there was this major suit where it was claimed that McDonald's products make children obese and diabetic, and the media response derided this lawsuit and took the position that I just mentioned. Of course fast foods have propensity for obesity, right? Of course, that's it. I mean, if you don't want fast foods, don't buy them, right? But no, these people wanted to sue. And it was widely commented at the time that the only people getting fat in all this were the lawyers. Now, the case actually succeeded. You have to prove a case like this, you have to prove unreasonable danger, inadequate warning, and causation. And the case succeeded on unreasonable danger. It was held that hamburgers have and possess an unreasonable danger of causing obesity. It was also agreed, it was held, that there were inadequate warnings, that McDonald's were not selling their hamburgers with a warning. The hamburgers were not delivered to you with a warning saying, this hamburger may make you obese. And so, but the whole thing failed on causation. It proved not to be possible to show that those particular hamburgers caused those particular children to become obese. And so the whole case was thrown out. The example shows us that there's an attempt to redefine what counts as the object and who's responsible for it at the center. And that resulted in a failed attempt to shift accountability. A little while later, same McDonald's had another problem. Who or what is accountable for burns caused by hot coffee? A woman, Liebeck, tried to sue McDonald's for serving hot coffee, which she spilt on her lap. So she would drive through, McDonald's drive through, order a coffee, she'd get a coffee, spill it on her lap, she'd burn herself. She'd complain that it was the fault of McDonald's for selling her the hot coffee, right? And again, much public reaction was, but for God's sake, if you're buying coffee, guess what? It's going to be hot. Be careful. No, the lawyers got busy. Is this another example of an over-litigious society where the individual refuses to accept responsibility? After all, coffee is meant to be hot. And the lawyers argued that the coffee was hotter than in other restaurants, that it caused the most serious kind of third-degree burns, that it was just one of a long series of similar burns, and the award succeeded. Liebeck got $2.7 million for, quotes, willful, reckless, or malicious conduct on the part of McDonald's. So I think what's really interesting here is the ontological re-specification of the coffee performs a redistribution of the accountability relations. People buying the coffee are no longer responsible for being careful about whether it's hot or not. It becomes, as a result of this lawsuit, the fault of McDonald's. And notice how the ontological status shifts. The capacities, the identities, the expectations have shifted now in relation to a shift from merely hot coffee to something else. And it's very difficult to say this in a simple way. And I apologize for this, horrendous English. It's not just hot. It is recklessly, knowably, in defiance of warningsably, as just the latest in a series of similar eventsably hot. It's that kind of hot now. So the ontological respecification has changed what the coffee is and what hot is in the coffee, and the change of ontology has changed the accountability relations that are involved. Okay, second example, the wrong bin bag. This is the sad story about Lynette, who was fined £50 for using the wrong bin bags. And Lynette's story is played out in one of the tabloid newspapers. And I've just a close up there. There she is holding the black bag she used, but because it was not a council official issued black bag, she was fined £50 by the council for using the wrong kind of black plastic bag. She just bought a plastic bag from the store, but it was the wrong kind of black plastic bag. And the newspaper made a big deal of this. And in particular, here you see pictures of Lynette. I love this photograph on the bottom here, stunned. Lynette with her own bag and daft penalty notice. And you can just imagine the photographer saying, "Can you look a bit more stunned? Can you be more stunned, please, for the photograph?" Now, the narrative is very interesting because what we're interested in here is how it is that it's possible for something to be, for a bin bag to be wrong. All right, something as mundane and ordinary as a bin bag to suddenly possess the quality of being incorrect in some way. And I won't do it now, but there's some very powerful techniques of textual analysis, and textual analysis in particular following the work of Dorothy Smith, whose work I admire very much, where she shows how you can look at the way the text is organized so that you can see various structures in the text, and those structures in the text organize and portray and define certain sets of social relations such that the ordinariness of the bin bag is established. So the questions are, what are the processes of the political constitution of these entities? How does the discursive organization make possible these relations of governance? How does the organization of the text provide for a moral order? How does it make available a cast of characters, assigning attributes to each, depicting the network of rights and responsibilities? Importantly, this is not just a story which is weaved around given objects, but the story about Lynette and her troubles establishes her black bag as a reasonable, ordinary black bag. Right. The very character of the object, the ontology of the bin bag, is constituted in and through the organization of the text. So that's why we get to this question. How can a mere bag disrupt political relations? How can a bag become an event? How can a bin bag be wrong? And there's absolutely no time to do the full analysis here, but I'll concentrate on one aspect of it. And one aspect of it is that the moral order in the narrative is portrayed through this cumulative contrast structure between entities in the story. And it turns out when you look at it that the story involved two sets of characters. On the one hand, the evildoers, the left-hand side of that column there, and on the other hand, innocent victims. And they're set in contrast with each other, and their actions are then can be heard as contrasting with each other and so on. And the contrast is between the evildoers, who are the balmy council bosses, on the one hand, and the innocent victims, who are normal people, an unmarried mum of 4, and so on. And these kind of contrasts work towards not just the differing moralities of the two sets of people, but also they establish the ordinariness of the bin bag. You see, you can imagine another story where an unmarried mum of 4 is a completely irresponsible member of society. How could she have 4 kids and be unmarried? It's outrageous. This is another story about unwanted teenage pregnancy in the UK. No, in this story, it is involved as evidence of her innocence and her being put upon by the balmy council bosses, the overzealous wardens, and so on. So the contrast between balmy and normal turns on the apprehension of the object and what counts as appropriate behaviour with and towards it. And so the mundanity of the bin bag, what every reasonable person knows about the nature and the purpose of bin bags, reinforces the moral contrast between the balmies and the normals. And evildoers can include balmy council bosses, overzealous wardens. Overzealous wardens rip open the bags, so that's the action of an evildoer. And later on in the story, in a way which seems not connected at all, but wardens for Crewe and Nantwich Borough Council are also enlisted under this typology of evildoers, because it turns out that they were implicated in fining a woman for littering. On the right-hand side, there was a woman fined for littering while she was feeding another innocent category, birds. So you have this whole sort of moral narrative structure. So what the object is, what the bag is, and what it's for, and what should be in it, what's appropriate or inappropriate behaviour towards it, they're all tied to and exemplify the structure of this same moral order. That's how you get mundanity produced through these kinds of contrastive structures. Okay, so I've been talking for quite a long time. Let me see, what time do we have? Half an hour, okay. So I'll just go on a little bit more and then open it for some questions. Having talked our way through the shifting provocations in STS and the ways in which those provocations have shifted with respect to the idea of symmetry, having talked about the ways in which those provocations have shifted with respect to the move from essentialism to post-essentialism, we can now return a bit to the influence of STS and pick up on some points from yesterday. It's quite clear that STS is growing in influence, and I often quote this call for papers from a 2003 Cornell conference. In the past decade and a half, STS has evolved intellectually, built institutional strength, forged links with other disciplines, new communities and policy-relevant areas. STS has begun to make its mark in economic theory, anthropology, music. I'm sure Trevor wrote this, actually. Environmental governance, legal discourse, science education, science policy, and a broad range of public institutions, from funding agencies to science museums to transnational NGOs. All these are beginning to incorporate STS insights into their thinking, and I think it's true. I think it's a rather sort of triumphalist a message, and not a little self-satisfied. But the potential of utility of STS, given all those moves that we've discussed before, is clear for a wide range of disciplines, for scientists and technologists, for business and management. But there remains the issue of what happens when STS is appropriated by new institutions like business schools. How much is the radical and critical provocation of STS attenuated? I'm very fond of the work by Mel Polner, an ethnomethodologist, who wrote in 1991, he complained that the radical reflexivity of ethnomethodology, the radical reflexivity, has settled down and moved out to the suburbs. I mean, he was working in Los Angeles, so this is a very vivid metaphor. It used to be right where the action is, downtown, causing all kinds of trouble and getting people, provoking people and causing mayhem and violence. But now it's become settled and middle-aged, and it's moved out to the suburbs and settled down. And one wonders if STS sometimes is on the same path. Are there elements of critical, argumentative, provocative STS which have now settled down and moved out to the suburbs? I talked about the misuse yesterday of laboratory life. And in the context of business schools, could we say that STS has now both settled down and got its MBA? Okay, so just to conclude a few things. Sorry, kind of very, very summary overview. As I said, several months worth of courses of STS delivered to you within an hour. What is the value of STS? For me, it's the capacity to renew and reinvent itself. It's the capacity to provoke and challenge assumptions. What's the value of STS? Well, there's quite interesting things we could do. We could use STS itself to answer this question. What is STS's actor network? If it is correct that actor networks, successful building of actor networks guarantee success, then what are the actor networks of STS? Have they guaranteed success, and in what sense? Can users of STS be configured? So again, an understanding of the success of technologies is when you adequately configure your users of the technology. Can you configure your users of STS? How best to go about that? How can users of STS be taught what to want? Because invariably in selling technologies, you don't address people's wants, you don't address their pre-existing needs, you teach them what they want, you teach them what to want. And again, referring back to yesterday, what is STS's certainty trough? And how do we manage that slope of certainty such that we get this very large population of configured users who are certain and confident in the products of STS? So is there one thing called STS? No. We've said there's not, but now we have a good reason why there's not, because we remember that it could be otherwise. So for any version of STS, there is always an alternative, otherwise version of it. And as a gesture to Anne-Marie Mole and multiplicity, is there one thing called STS? No. There are multiple STSs, and that's one of the things that's really most interesting about it. So just to end then, just to remind you, it's getting a bit boring actually. A central enduring provocation of STS is it could be otherwise. I've said, and I've tried to describe how that's cashed out in different dimensions, and the two I've mentioned are provocations in terms of it could be otherwise with the symmetry, different forms of symmetry which characterize the history of STS, and different reactions to the problem of essentialism over a period of time as well. There are increasingly new audiences for STS. I think there is a worrying concern that a lot of STS has a tendency towards adopting safe, explanatory formulae. People would prefer to stay at one point on that graph that I showed you earlier, rather than moving on and exploring new dimensions. I think there's been a very interesting move from ethnography through technography to ontography. And I'll probably leave you with the thought that whereas when we started STS, everyone imagined that science was the hardest possible case of knowledge production. And if we could show that science was socially constructed, then any other kind of knowledge would be available for social construction. That science was the hardest possible case. Now I think that ordinary, everyday objects, mundane things, that is, things which are of the world and just the way they are, that's the new hardest possible case for STS. Thank you very much.
I will try to put on points. First, about the point, you were talking about the theory of STS. I think it's very strong and very complicated. But if I understood clearly, building a successful network means that we are getting some unprobematically working object, like black box or something like this. But in case of STS, we have only a lot of reflexivity, we have some dimension, some different schools, some different perspectives, we have some ethnographies. And what is the black box of STS now? It is first one. And when you were talking about schools, you said that we have this switching to new post-essentialist area, post-essentialist job. But we will have with classical schools. For example, I remember criticism of Bruno Latour to David Boone, and David Boone pointed and stressed that he's standing on the same points, on the same rules that he stated on the beginning of his career. He wrote this book and he knows that it's right. It's from Latour's I don't know. So, and Latour's answer was that it's your problem that you don't change its first part. And the second part is, I think it's mainly common. I think that your questions about security, about traffic, I think Russian case studies can provide very big ontological and practical challenge to a lot of STS assumptions. For example, when you were talking about security, I just remember two main examples. For example, in Russian academic institutes in Moscow and here in St. Petersburg, we had a very funny system of security. We have it now. I don't know, maybe you know that previously we had this old women security. Like we had this old woman who was angry old woman who was working as a guard. And now when we have this politics of modernization and we have these MPs, but what happens? In institutions, Russian academic science system, we have double system. We have an old lady and an AD card. People do double check, like they put the card and after that they
What's the question?
No. Last is not question, it's comment. Like we have
Okay.
very another structure of technology, widespread, something like this.
Okay. No, this way. An example of the black box might be the widespread assumption that there is a particular relationship between drivers and their cars. So, for example, that it is widely assumed, and you know, a dominant view is that the main problem with accidents and speeding is the driver. And you know, when I was caught and sent on this re-education course, it was to readjust my psychology so that I accepted and understood that I was to blame for the driving. Now, I think that's it's such an entrenched view that there is, on the one hand, this human entity, on the other hand, this non-human entity, the car, and they're in particular relation to each other. That trying to understand why that's so entrenched, why that particular distribution of ontologies is so widely accepted, and I think that's, for example, a target for SDS at the moment. On the re-education course, after about 2 hours, the instructor, the leader of the discussion, said something like, "So, what do you think is the main thing that causes speeding?" It was asking around the class, and people said things like not paying attention, or thinking of something else, or being in a hurry for work. And then one person said, "You know, there's some cars, you've just got to drive them fast." And everyone in the room went, "No." And the instructor said, "Yes, but you choose whether or not to drive it fast." He said, "No, there's some cars which are really fast cars, and you just have to drive them." And the rest of us are going, "Please, no, we want to get out of here. You know, we may, you know, what's going to happen? We're going to get another penalty. Who is this idiot saying?" And this went on and on and on. And it was a very, very interesting moment, because it was like such a complete challenge to the sort of prevailing ontological distribution that people thought he was crazy, or he was joking. He was behaving in a completely unacceptable way. And it's that strength of entrenchment of the view, for example, that it's the individual psyche that has to be managed with respect to the given object, the car. That's the kind of black box which I think I'm interested in untackling. I wouldn't call it so much a black box, but it's like an entrenched ontology, or it's an entrenched view of an ontology. I think your other question about changing questions is a very interesting one, because I accept that certainly for people who are starting research, they need to try and figure out a perspective or an approach or a way of doing things, and they might decide that actor network theory is something to explore and so on. And I think that it's a necessary starting point, that you start with a formula. I would urge that in the spirit of STS, you not only apply the formula, but you try and be critical of the formula as well. So I think, for me, the least satisfactory PhD theses are a straightforward application of, say, Scott or reflexivity or actor network theory to a particular problem. I'm much more interested in finding out what are the issues which could be built upon and moved. What's the next step? Starting your empirical study, I absolutely agree. You've got to, pick an approach. Use the approach, but be critical about it too, is my recommendation.
Just a few questions about the concepts you use. First, what do you think about this? If you mention ontological politics, what do you think about the notion of the concept of hinterland that John Boy is trying to use? Yeah, because when you are analyzing singular objects, mundane objects, huge infrastructure behind it. It's not a single mobile phone, it's not a single plastic bag, it's just like part of a huge machinery which is behind it, and we have to take it into consideration all the time, and so on and so on. Because your story reminds me the story how university management was accused in sexism because elevators in High School of Economics building didn't want to work if the person inside of it is less than 55 kilos. So they had to wait for another one to come, and then they could use it. So the reply was, you are sexist yourself because you are not taking into consideration that there are a few male students that are less than 55 kilos too. So you are drawing political distinctions over technology. That's what Professor Radai said. So that's the idea of hinterland one. And second, in that methodology, it was a big shift from young Garfinkel who used the concept of oriented object to late Garfinkel who used the concept of as of which object. I never could understand what does it mean. This as of which, but the idea was actually very close to yours because it's like ontological status of object is not a constant, it's variable. It depends on local context, practical context that's used, and so on and so on. So what do you think about this whole similar families of conceptual thinking that also refers to the, as I see it, to the same thing?
Thank you very much, Victor. I must say that's one of the two of the best questions I've ever had. The hinterland argument is quite interesting, but I'm much more interested in how hinterlands are invoked and described and discovered. So I'm not particularly satisfied with the assertion that any object has a hinterland. I think what's interesting is how objects are made to have hinterlands for particular purposes. So in the example you describe of the lift, I don't think there's much purchase for us to say, you know, the thing about lifts is they have these gendered problems built into them. And, you know, but what is interesting is a debate which turns the lift into a possibly gendered object. And I'd be interested in studying how that's done, because that seems to me precisely what I'm trying to do with ontological politics. It's about a re-specification of what, after all, the lift is said to be, in order to do some kind of political work. Right. So to read John Law as saying that you know, ordinary objects have a hinterland behind them, I think is not very productive. I mean, to read him as saying that there are disputes and debates and attributions and quarrels and arguments about what that hinterland might be, if there is one, that's very interesting indeed. On the ethnomethodology point, I think of myself as I mean, I have a curious relationship with Garfinkel, not least because I'm one of the many people he ripped off, right? Stole stuff from me, you know, that's another story. But he had, certainly towards the end of his writings, this commitment to the notion of unique adequacy. And unique adequacy, as far as anyone can understand what he was talking about, refers to the properties of the phenomenon that's being studied, such that you can only tell if it's a good study with reference to those properties. So whereas all other social scientists bring perspectives, apparatus, ideas to bear upon phenomenon, Garfinkel's idea was that the phenomenon itself would speak to the social scientist. Right, and you can just hear anthropologists going crazy at this point. What are you talking about? You know, so, the story I like to tell is of my friend Eric Livingston and his PhD on mathematics. And Garfinkel decided that the only people who would know whether Eric's thesis on the ethnomethodology of mathematics was any good or not were mathematicians. And so Eric's committee, as I understand it, comprised 8 mathematicians plus Garfinkel. So here you have, you know, a complete, you know, really challenging and typically kind of strange Garfinkel notion that whether or not a study is good, the adequacy of the research, of the description, must derive from somehow the inherent properties of the object. I mean, it makes little sense to me, but it's a very challenging idea.
Well, as always, I have a question of the clear president as well. So, I don't know if you're asking.
There would be a huge conflict between this question and the previous one. When a scholar giving a masterclass is expected to give some personal details on his or her biography as a role model. So could you please tell us, you told us that he was 19 in 1976, and could you tell us some more detail on how Lower Life was reaching? What was the division of labor? Who wrote in each part, or how we involved the text, and what was the greatest problem with important in that book?
Ah, okay. Yeah, I'll give you a version of that, but please take the health warning, right? Just as you spotted, there might be a problem with my claim that I was 19 in 1976. You might want to think that there might be problems with other claims that I make in what I'm going to say now. As I recall it, as I said, I visited Bruno when he first arrived at the Salk Institute. He had gone there to do a project on the biographies of great scientists, especially Roger Guillemin, and especially scientists who came from foreign origins. So the notion was that if you were a foreigner, you had more capacity to innovate. Right? That was the sort of idea. And at that point, I think it's fair to say Bruno was not really aware of what was going on in sociology of science or social studies of science. And so we were sort of thrown together, and he said, "Why don't you come and have a look at where I am in the laboratory?" And he gave me a tour of the laboratory, and I vividly remember him giving me the tour of the laboratory from a very anthropological point of view. So he introduced me in the laboratory, not to the people, but to the things in the laboratory. And he would go around and, for example, go to a desk and pick up a pipette. Everyone knows what a pipette is? And he would say, "This, they believe, enables them to measure the volume of a liquid." And put it down with great reverence. And it just seemed to me that this was exactly the kind of skeptical, inside, as it happens, perspective that we could develop. We agreed to write something together. We commuted between Paris and Oxford after his return from the stay at San Diego. It is all Bruno's field work, but the writing was done collaboratively. As I recall, we drafted 3 chapters each. We then swapped them round quite a lot and changed each other's writings. I don't recall, Oleg was asking me about a particular aspect of it and whether I was responsible for it. I'm very nervous now about saying which bits I was responsible for, because it was very mixed up indeed. I do recall that at that time Bruno's English was not great, that he had taught himself English by translating Hobbes' Leviathan. So he had some very curious turns of archaic English in his vocabulary. And editorially, I had some control, because I could simply say, you need to inject the word "not" there to make it better English. So that was really the sort of basis of the writing. The publishers, Sage, Bruno contacted people in San Francisco, Sage Inc., not the London office, who were very interested in this book. We had a big fight with them because we wanted to call it Science in the Making, which we felt was the appropriate title for the book, Science in the Making. And the editors insisted on Laboratory Life, which we thought was just stupid. Until several years later we realized the pun that was involved at the Laboratory Life was about the biological life and about human life, right? So the editors suggested that, and we didn't see that. That first edition was published in 1979. As the 1980s went on, we got more and more messages from people who's complaining that they weren't able to buy copies of the book because it had gone out of print. And Sage had let the book go out of print, and at that point we invoked the clause in the contract that enabled us to switch to another publisher. And it was taken up then by Princeton University Press. The book was not widely accepted as a stunning classic from the start, and got quite a few interesting sort of ambivalent reviews, including one from a realist philosopher of science who said that he didn't really understand what all the fuss was about. This was just a description of how scientists discovered reality, and just left it at that, really. And it has acquired much more recently a kind of iconic status, which is, I think, to do with all kinds of issues and institutional moves, and not to be consistent with my own position, reflecting the inner glory and brilliance of the book. As I said before, I think it's quite interesting. It's become one of those books. I was going to compare it with Kuhn, but it's nothing like as the impact that Kuhn's book has had. But most people know about Kuhn's book, and they can give a version of Kuhn's book even though they've never read it and probably have never bought it. And there are similar books that have that kind of have that sort of thing happen to them, like Lucy Suchman's Plans and Situated Practice. There's Plans and Situated Action, where the back of the book has quotes on it from eminent designers who say, no designer should design without reading this book. And it's very well known in design circles. It's much less clear how often it's been read in those design circles. So again, it sort of takes on a kind of iconic status, which has, I think it has positive functions for the field, but they may be only tangentially related to the content of the book. Is that enough?
Well, when it gets into personal detail, it gets very interesting. You just started with it and you're finishing with it, and we've got a 15-minute break before anything to come in. But my last personal point is not about the past, but about the future. Because I will still bombard you with email about what's going on with your studies, our studies. And having looked at the examples you suggested, there's only one which fitted contemporary Russian experience in terms of mundane governance. There's no garbage selection right now in Russia. They dump it all together. There's no successful legal suits, cases when people sue manuals. I don't really know. There's one thing I can recommend is the study, and I'm thinking about possible, master's essays topics to our students. Like the one thing, of course, is possible right now. We finally have this British type road traffic cameras installed in Moscow when they issue traffic fines. But that requires, of course, access to the field. That is, I have to call Mayor Sobyanin to deposit the students into, I think, part of the traffic police. During your presence here in the last 2 days, and this is your first visit to Russia, did you see any objects of mundane governance where Russia kind of shares with the West something which would be interesting to study?
Well, I think it's fascinating that you don't have this kind of totalitarian system of recycling yet. And I think you have there the perfect opportunity to study how it's going to come into being quite soon, and what form it will take. So its absence is actually an advantage, I think. I mean, so you can get to that.
You should get to our garbage heaps, outside of the city.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. I would love to do that. I mean, I think comparative studies is very possible, even if we don't have exactly the same forms of governance in respect to recycling. The traffic issue, I think is very ripe for study. One of the things I've been doing, partly connected with this study, is collecting a large volume of YouTube clips, because it turns out that traffic in other countries is a genre which fills YouTube a lot of the time. So people visit countries other than their own, and they take video clips of traffic situations and then return to whence they came and post them. And usually they post the clip, and you watch the clip and you see what for them are very strange things going on, and then they have a comment saying, so these guys don't need traffic lights at all. Why do we need traffic lights? Look, they do very well without them. And so there's a whole kind of industry of folk ethnography going on, where people are collecting these travellers' tales and showing them. So you get, clips of streets in Vietnam where there are no lights and cars just moving in and out, and pedestrians walking across, and nobody seems to get hurt. There don't seem to be many accidents. So people are saying, how come we need all these bloody traffic lights? They do very well in Vietnam. And one subgenre of this is the terrible traffic problems in Russia. Of course, I'm not agreeing they are terrible or not, but I'm saying that one subgenre of this folk collection of strange things that go on with traffic in other countries. And I was sharing with Elena some of the clips about the worst intersection in the world is claimed to be in St. Petersburg. And there's a clip of about 9 minutes of cars smashing into each other, allegedly a very curious thing that's happening in this far-off foreign place. So I think that those kinds of international comparisons and folk ethnographies are really interesting, because they're about perceived differences in mundane governance and perceived differences in the ontologies which support particular policies. Lots of opportunity there.
Steve, I'm really sorry we have to cut this short. We should have started with this yesterday, actually. And then we all examples over dinners, breaks, coffees, and everything. But we have Andy presenting in 10 minutes. You have to run to the airport. And then about Andy's presentation, I should warn everybody. Those people who wanted to know something about technological determinism, but showed up 20 minutes late to Steve's talk, they missed all of his points when he was putting that on the screen. So how would I put it? I ask you to be here at 2 p.m. sharp when Andy starts. Otherwise, you'll miss parts of Andy's presentation as well. But right now,
can I just say thank you to everyone. I mean, it's been an absolute pleasure and delight meeting everyone and receiving the energy and enthusiasm for the work in this area. And special thanks for Oleg to managing this so brilliantly and orchestrating it so well. So thank you.